Welcome to Sleepy Harbor. Settle in. Wherever you are right now, whatever kind of day you are carrying with you into this quiet hour, let yourself arrive here slowly. There is nothing you need to do tonight. Nothing to solve, nothing to fix, nothing to figure out before morning. You can let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been hovering all day. You can let the breath you have been half holding go all the way out. We are going to spend this long, soft stretch of night together, and the only thing being asked of you is to listen, or to half listen, or to drift off somewhere in the middle and not hear the end at all. That is allowed. That is, in fact, the whole idea. Tonight we are going to slow down together and spend some time with something the researchers call sensory processing sensitivity. It is a long phrase, so let it land gently. Sensory processing sensitivity, which the people who study it shorten to just 3 letters, SPS, and there is a warmer, more human name for the person who carries a lot of this trait. They are called a highly sensitive person. You may have heard that phrase before, tossed around in conversation, maybe even used about you in a way that did not feel kind. Highly sensitive person. We will let those words soften over the next few hours because by the time the night is through, I hope they will feel less like a label someone pinned to you and more like a quiet, accurate description of a particular and rather beautiful way of being built. You do not need to know anything about psychology to listen tonight. You do not need to have read any books or taken any quizzes or wondered, even once, whether any of this applies to you. We will explain every term in plain language as it comes gently, in the same breath we use it. If a word sounds clinical, I will set it down beside something ordinary so you can hold both at once. There is nothing here to memorize. If you wake tomorrow remembering only a single image, a single phrase, that is more than enough. And if you remember nothing at all, only that you felt calm and seen for a little while in the dark, then that is enough too. So before we begin, take one slow, deep breath, in through the nose if that feels good, and let it go all the way with no hurry at all. Feel the weight of your body where it rests, the mattress beneath you or the cushion, or wherever you have landed for the night. Notice how the surface holds you up completely, so that you do not have to hold yourself up at all. Let it take the whole of your weight, and if you would like, you can let me know in the quiet of your own mind. Or, if you are the sort who likes to leave a small note in the dark, you might share what time it is where you are and where in the world you are listening from. There is something gentle in knowing that somewhere a harbor light is on and someone is keeping watch while you rest. Thank you for joining us here at Sleepy Harbor. Let us begin. I want to start not with a definition, but with a flower, 2 flowers really. Picture a dandelion. You know this one. It is the small, bright, stubborn yellow flower that grows in the crack of a sidewalk, in the hard, dry soil at the edge of a parking lot, in a lawn nobody waters. The dandelion does not ask for much. It does not need rich earth or careful tending or shelter from the wind. It simply grows almost anywhere, in good conditions and in poor ones, more or less the same. It is hardy, it is resilient. Drop a dandelion seed almost anywhere, and it will find a way to live. There is a quiet strength in that, the strength of the thing that does not break easily, that does not seem to feel the cold the way other things do. Now picture an orchid. The orchid is a different kind of living thing altogether. You have perhaps seen one on a windowsill, those delicate, almost impossibly elegant blooms, and you may know that an orchid is harder to keep. It is fussy, people say. Too much sun, and it suffers. Too little, and it suffers. The wrong water, the wrong room, a draught from the window, and the orchid wilts, drops its flowers, looks for all the world as though it is dying. People look at a struggling orchid in a window where a dandelion would have thrived without a second thought, and they conclude that the orchid is simply weaker, more fragile, harder to love perhaps because it asks so much. But here is the thing about the orchid that we so often forget. When the orchid does get what it needs, the right light, the right warmth, the patient and attentive care, it does not merely survive the way the dandelion survives, it blooms. It produces something the dandelion never could, a flower of such depth and intricacy and quiet astonishing beauty that people will cross a room just to look at it. The orchid is not a weaker flower, it is a more responsive one. It is more affected by where it is planted. For worse, yes, when the conditions are poor, but also, and this is the part the world keeps forgetting, for better, far better, when the conditions are good. This image, the orchid and the dandelion, comes from the work of two researchers, Thomas Boyce and Bruce Ellis, who proposed it back in 2005 as a way of understanding why some living things, some children, some people, seem so much more shaped by their surroundings than others. And I want you to hold this picture in your mind tonight, loosely, the way you would hold something you are not afraid of dropping. Because your nervous system, if you are the sort of person we are talking about tonight, may be built more like the orchid than the dandelion. Not weaker, not broken, not too much. Simply more responsive, more affected by everything in both directions. The same finely tuned wiring that leaves you flooded and frayed at the end of a loud, crowded, demanding day is the very same wiring that lets you feel a piece of music move through your chest like weather, that lets you sense a friend's sadness before they have said a single word, that lets you stand at the edge of the sea or under a sky full of stars and feel something open in you that other people seem to walk right past. We will come back to the orchid many times tonight. It is the heart of everything we are going to talk about. But I wanted you to meet it first before any of the science, because I think it is the kindest possible doorway into all of this. Now, let me speak to you directly for a moment, the way I imagine you might be lying there right now. Perhaps you know this feeling. You lie down to sleep at the end of a full day, and your body is tired, genuinely tired, heavy in the right way, but your mind will not come down with it. Your mind is still going. It is still processing. It is replaying a conversation from the afternoon, turning over something a colleague said, noticing the particular tone in someone's voice that you could not stop noticing all day. It is registering the hum of the refrigerator, the sound of a car somewhere down the street, the faint scratch of the sheets, the light leaking under the door. Everything is just a little too loud, a little too bright, a little too much, and your tired body is asking your busy mind, please, can we rest now? And the mind keeps working, keeps sorting, keeps feeling, long after you wish it would stop. And maybe, somewhere along the way, someone taught you to call that a flaw. Maybe someone told you that you were too sensitive, that you needed thicker skin, that you should not let things get to you the way they do, that you take things too personally, feel things too deeply, get overwhelmed too easily by rooms and crowds and noise and conflict that other people seem to move through without a scratch. Maybe you came to believe, quietly, somewhere underneath all your thoughts, that there is something a little bit wrong with you, that your wiring is faulty, that you are, in some way you cannot quite name, defective in a world that everyone else seems to handle just fine. I want to say something to you very gently, and I want you to let it sink in slowly, the way warmth sinks into cold hands. That restless, flooded, deeply processing mind that comes to you at night is not a broken mind. It is not new, and it is not yours alone. It is one of the oldest, most studied, most genuinely understood patterns in the whole of human temperament. The thing you have been carrying as a private failing is, it turns out, a recognized and well-researched trait shared by a great many people, found across the natural world, written right into the architecture of a particular kind of nervous system. You are not too much. you are tuned in. And a nervous system that is tuned in to everything has very good reasons for needing, at the end of the day, exactly the kind of quiet we are settling into right now. So let us go gently into the science of it, and I promise to keep it soft and to leave nothing unexplained. The first thing worth knowing is how common this is. When researchers first began to study high sensitivity carefully, the estimates they arrived at placed it at somewhere around 15 to 20% of people. Let that number settle for a moment. Roughly 1 in every 5 or 6 people you have ever met, the person beside you on the bus, someone in your family almost certainly, possibly you. This is not a rare and isolated condition affecting a strange few. This is a substantial slice of the whole human family walking around, mostly unaware that there is a name for the way they experience the world. We will return to that number later in the night because more recent research has refined it in an interesting way, but for now hold on to that simple, steadying fact. You are in very large and very good company. The person we have to thank for naming and mapping all of this is a psychologist named Dr. Elaine N. Aron. In 1997, working together with her husband, Aron, who is himself a well-known researcher of human relationships, she published the foundational study that gave this trait its scientific shape. Before her work, the idea floated around in scattered pieces, sensed by many, named by none. Elaine Aron is the one who gathered those pieces together, gave the trait its proper name, sensory processing sensitivity, and built a way to actually measure it. That measure is called the Highly Sensitive Person Scale. It is a set of 27 questions, 27 gentle prompts, asking things like whether you are easily overwhelmed by bright lights or strong smells or loud noises, whether you are deeply moved by the arts or by music, whether you notice and are affected by subtle things in your environment that others seem to miss. 27 questions, and from the pattern of the answers, a picture of how much of this trait a person carries. That scale, first published in that 1997 paper, is still the instrument most of the research uses to this day. It has held up. It has proven itself study after study, year after year. And here is the part I most want you to hear clearly, so let me say it plainly and let it stand on its own. This is not a disorder, it is not a diagnosis, it is not a syndrome or a sickness or anything that belongs in a doctor's manual of things gone wrong. Sensory processing. Sensitivity does not appear in the manual that catalogues psychological disorders. It's what clinicians call the DSM. And it does not appear there for the simple reason that it is not one. It is a temperament, it is a personality trait. It is a normal, natural variation in the way a human nervous system is built and the way it processes information, in exactly the same way that being tall or being musical or having a particular color of eyes is a variation, not a malfunction. Some nervous systems are built to process the world lightly and quickly. Some are built to process it deeply and thoroughly. Both are valid. Both have advantages. Neither is the correct one and the other the mistake. You were not assembled incorrectly. You were assembled differently, and tonight, slowly, we are going to come to understand what that difference actually is and why it is, in so many ways, a gift. So what is it really, this difference? What is actually happening in a highly sensitive nervous system that makes the world land so much more heavily? Elaine Aron gathered the whole of the trait into 4 central features, 4 pillars, that together describe what it means to be highly sensitive. She gave them a small memory shape so they would be easy to hold, but I'm not going to lean on the letters tonight because what matters is not the spelling, it is the thing itself. So let us simply walk through the 4, one at a time, slowly, over the course of the night. And the very first of them, the one that underlies all the others, the foundation that everything else is built upon, is this: depth of processing, depth of processing. Let me decode that phrase because it is the key to the whole of it. When something happens in front of you, a sound, a sight, a comment from a friend, a change in a room, any piece of information at all, your brain has to do something with it. And a highly sensitive brain does more with it. It processes that information more thoroughly, more elaborately, more completely. Where another person might take in a piece of information and respond to it quickly, almost reflexively, and move on, the highly sensitive brain holds it a little longer. It turns it over. It relates the new thing to past experiences, to similar moments, to everything it already knows. It cross-references, it considers. It looks at the thing from several angles before it decides what to do. Think of it this way. Imagine two people walk into a room. One of them glances around, registers roughly where the furniture is, notes that there are some people present, and gets on with whatever they came to do. The other walks into the same room and, without even trying, takes in the particular quality of the light, the slight tension between two of the people standing by the window, the smell of coffee gone a little cold, the painting on the wall that is hanging just slightly crooked, the fact that someone has recently been crying, though they are smiling now. Same room, same 2 seconds. But one brain processed the surface, and the other processed the depths. That deeper processing is not a choice. It is not the highly sensitive person trying harder or being nosy or overthinking on purpose. It is automatic. It is simply how that nervous system is built to take in the world. And here is the truly remarkable thing. This is not just a poetic way of describing an inner experience. It has been seen. It has been watched directly in the living brain. In 2011, a researcher named Jadzia Jagielowicz, working with Elaine Aron and others, did something rather wonderful. She placed highly sensitive people inside a brain scanner, a machine that lets researchers watch which parts of the brain become active in real time, lighting up as they work. And she gave them a subtle task. She showed them pairs of photographs of outdoor scenes, and the photographs had small differences between them, tiny changes, a fence post moved, a bale of hay added or taken away, the kind of small detail you might easily miss, and she watched what their brains did as they searched for those subtle differences. What she found was this. When highly sensitive people examined those scenes and noticed those small changes, the regions of their brains associated with higher-order visual processing and with careful attention to detail lit up more strongly than they did in people who were lower in the trait. More of the brain working harder, going deeper, paying closer attention to the subtle and the fine. The depth of processing we had only been able to describe from the inside. That sense that you notice more, that you take in more, that your mind does more with every passing moment, was now visible, glowing on a screen, written in the actual activity of the living brain. It was real. It had always been real. Now there was a picture of it. I find something deeply comforting in that, and I hope you do too. For so long, a highly sensitive person might have suspected that they were imagining it, that the sense of feeling more and noticing more was just a story they told themselves, perhaps even an excuse. And here was proof, drawn straight from the brain, that no, you really are processing the world more deeply. It is not in your imagination. It is in your insula and your visual cortex and the careful, attentive circuitry of a mind built to look closely at things. You were right about yourself all along. Now, this depth of processing is the root. It is the first pillar and the foundation of all the rest, and I want you to carry it with you as we go because it explains a great deal that is coming. The deeper you process, the more you take in, the more you notice, the more thoroughly you consider. And as we will see when we continue, that very depth, that very richness comes with a cost as natural and as inevitable as the gift itself. The brain that does more with every moment also, quite simply, has more to do. But we will come to that. We have all night, and there is no hurry at all. For now, let us pause here together, just for a moment. Take a slow, deep breath in and out and notice how your body has perhaps grown a little heavier since we began, a little more willing to be held by whatever holds you. Notice the quiet in the room, the way the world has lowered its voice for the night. Notice that there is nothing being asked of you here. No problem to process, no detail to catch, no mood to read, nothing to figure out or remember. For this one stretch of night, your deeply processing mind can set down its work. It can let the world be simple. It can let the room be just a room, the dark be just the dark, the sound of my voice be just a sound to drift along on like a small boat carried gently on a calm tide. And when you are ready, in no hurry at all, we will continue together. Welcome to Sleepy Harbor. Tonight we are going to slow down together and spend some time with something quiet and true about the way certain minds are made. About a trait the researchers call sensory processing sensitivity, and about the gentler, more familiar name that grew up alongside it, the highly sensitive person. You do not need to know anything about psychology to listen. You do not need to remember a single term. If you have ever felt like more of the world reaches you than seems to reach the people around you, then this is for you, and there is nothing to figure out, nowhere else to be. Feel free to share, if you like, what time it is and where you are listening from tonight. And then let yourself settle in. Take a slow, deep breath. Wherever you are, however the day has been, let yourself be held here for a while. Thank you for joining us here at Sleepy Harbor. Let us begin. There is an image I want to give you first, before anything else, because it holds the whole of this within it, and because it is the kind of picture you can let drift behind your eyes as you fall asleep. Imagine two flowers growing side by side. One is a dandelion. The dandelion will grow almost anywhere. Crack in the pavement, edge of a field, dry season, wet season, neglected or tended, it hardly matters. The dandelion simply lives. It is hardy and forgiving, and it asks little of the world. The other flower is an orchid. The orchid is a different kind of thing entirely. Put it in a cold draught in poor soil in a harsh and careless window, and it will wilt. It will close in on itself and struggle. But give the orchid the right warmth, the right light, the right care, and it will bloom into something almost impossibly beautiful, something the dandelion, for all its toughness, was never built to become. Two researchers, Boyce and Bruce Ellis, gave us this picture back in 2005, and it is one of the most quietly important ideas in all of this, because here is what it tells us. Some nervous systems are dandelions. They are robust, they shrug off a great deal, the conditions around them barely register. And some nervous systems are orchids. They are deeply responsive to their surroundings, for worse, yes, when the surroundings are harsh, but also, and this is the part the world so often forgets, for better, when the surroundings are kind. The orchid is not the weaker flower. It is the more responsive one. It feels its conditions in both directions. And if your nervous system is built more like the orchid, then a hard, loud, careless day will cost you more than it costs others. But a warm, beautiful, gentle moment will reach you more deeply than it reaches them too. The same sensitivity working both ways. Hold that flower in your mind, the orchid. And let me say something gently to you now, something you may have needed to hear for a long time. The restless mind that comes to you at night. The one that will not quiet. The one that keeps turning over the day, replaying a conversation, catching a worry. Noticing one more thing, and then one more, and then one more. That mind is not a flaw in you. It is not a defect, not a weakness, not a sign that something has gone wrong with the way you were made. It is one of the oldest and most ordinary variations there is in how a human being can be wired. You are not broken. You are not too much. You are an orchid lying in the dark with a nervous system that has spent all day taking in more than its share of the world and is only now, in the quiet, finally beginning to set it down. Let me give you the shape of what we know so that you can rest inside it. This trait is real, and it has been studied carefully. Somewhere between 15 and 20% of people carry it. Roughly 1 in every 5 or 6 souls you have ever passed on a street or sat beside on a bus. So if it is you, you are far from alone. You are part of a large and quiet company of people who feel the world the way you do. The work of naming this and proving it belongs largely to a psychologist named Dr. Elaine N, who, together with her husband Arthur Aron, published the first careful study of it back in 1997. They built a measure for it, 27 gentle questions they called the Highly Sensitive Person Scale, and that simple instrument is still, to this day, how much of the research finds the people it studies. And here is the part I most want you to hold on to as you drift. This is not a disorder, it is not a diagnosis, not a syndrome, not an illness, not something to be cured, or corrected, or fixed. You will not find it listed in the great manuals of mental disorders because it does not belong there. It is a temperament, a trait, a perfectly normal variation in the way a nervous system can be tuned. No more a disorder than being tall or having a good ear for music or noticing colors a little more vividly than the person next to you. It is simply one of the ways a human being can come into the world. A way of being, not a thing to be ashamed of. So what, then, is actually happening inside an orchid mind? The researchers gathered the trait into 4 parts, and we will walk through them slowly, one at a time, with nothing rushed. Tonight, in this first part, I only want to give you the first of them, the deepest one, the root from which the others grow. And it is this: depth of processing. A highly sensitive mind does not skim across the surface of an experience, it goes down into it. Where another person might register a thing and move along, the deeply sensitive mind takes that same thing and turns it over and connects it to a memory and weighs it against something from years ago and follows it down into its meanings before it decides what to do. It processes more thoroughly, more elaborately. It relates each new thing to everything it already holds. This is not slowness, and it is not overthinking in any broken sense. It is simply a mind doing more with every moment that passes through it. And we are not guessing at this, we can see it. There was a researcher named Jadzia Jagielowicz who, in 2011, brought highly sensitive people into a brain scanner and gave them a simple task: to notice subtle differences in the scenes they were shown, small changes, the kind that are easy to miss. And what she found was that in the highly sensitive brains, the regions tied to deeper, higher-order processing, to careful attention and the catching of fine detail, lit up more strongly. Their brains were not merely seeing more, they were doing more with what they saw. The depth was not a feeling, not a story those people told about themselves. It was there, visible, in the living tissue of the mind. Let us pause here for a little while. Take another slow, deep breath in and gently out. And as you breathe, let this first idea settle softly into you, the way snow settles, without effort, without sound. Your mind is a deep one. It does more with the world than most, and that is the whole truth of it. Not a fault, not a burden you carried alone all this time, but a depth, the kind that lets a person feel and notice and understand in ways the surface-skimming world so often misses. Notice, if you can, how the room around you holds its quiet. Notice the weight of your own body finally still, finally allowed to be still. There is nothing here to process tonight, nothing to go deep into. You may simply float along the top of it all, light as the small boat on the calm tide, and let my voice carry you. And when you are ready, in no hurry at all, we will go on together into the rest of it. And here is where the story asks a harder question, because knowing that the highly sensitive person processes deeply, carefully, elaborately, that is the first piece. That is the beautiful piece. But depth has a cost, and the cost is something almost every sensitive person in the world has felt without ever having a name for it. The cost is this: all that extra processing takes something from you. Think, for a moment, of a net cast wide in water. The more of the water it covers, the more it catches. And catching more is extraordinary. You bring up fish that the smaller net never touches, creatures that live in the deeper, quieter parts of the water. But a full net is also a heavy net, and pulling a heavy net takes effort. It takes time. It takes more of your strength than pulling a net that only grazed the surface. The highly sensitive nervous system is cast wide. It is always catching the details, the subtleties, the undercurrents of a room, a conversation, an afternoon. It is working, even when it seems to you that you are doing nothing at all, simply sitting in a coffee shop or riding a bus or standing in a grocery store with the lights too bright and the music too loud and 3 conversations bleeding into each other from the surrounding tables. It is working. It is catching everything. And eventually the net grows heavy. This is what researchers call over-arousal, and it is the second of the 4 pillars that describe the highly sensitive person. The first pillar was depth of processing. The more thorough, elaborate, careful way the sensitive brain engages with information. The second pillar follows from the first with the clean logic of cause and effect. Because they process so deeply, highly sensitive people reach the point of overwhelm sooner under the same level of stimulation that others can sail through without much difficulty at all. The cost of depth is faster saturation. That is the whole sentence. Nothing more complicated than that. There is a principle in psychology, old and well established, that describes the relationship between arousal and performance. It was worked out more than a century ago by 2 psychologists named Robert Yerkes and John Dillingham Dodson, and what they found has never really stopped being true. The idea is this: there is an optimal level of stimulation, a kind of sweet spot at which we do our best work, feel most alert and capable and alive. Below that level, we are sluggish, bored, underengaged. Above it, we become scattered, anxious, overwhelmed. The curve rises and then it falls, and the peak in the middle is where we want to live if we can. For most people, the peak sits at a fairly high level of external input. A busy environment, a certain hum of activity, background noise, the small interruptions of a working day. These things don't push most people past the top of the curve. They sit comfortably on the rising slope, energized rather than flooded. But the highly sensitive person's peak sits earlier on that curve, not because they are weak and not because they are broken, but because they are already doing more. The same coffee shop that barely registers for the person beside you is for you a concert of input: the particular temperature of the air, the texture of the chair, the 4 different conversations, the quality of the light through the window, the mild chemical smell of the cleaning product someone used on the counter this morning. You are processing all of it. You are catching all of it in your wide net. And so you reach the top of the curve faster, not because you have less capacity, but because more of your capacity is already being used. When stimulation goes past that peak, the body responds. It has to. The nervous system that is already running closer to full will tip into overload before the one that has more room. And this is not a metaphor, this is measurable, physiological, real. The stress response activates, cortisol may rise. The body moves toward a kind of alertness that feels from the inside like an alarm that cannot quite be switched off. And then you come home from the loud day, and you are flooded. That is the word that comes up again and again when highly sensitive people describe what overstimulation feels like. Not tired exactly. Not simply in need of sleep, though sleep becomes desperately important. Flooded. As if too much has come in and none of it has finished being processed, and there is no room for anything else. The mind keeps moving, turning things over, catching the last threads of everything the day contained. You want to rest, but the net is still pulling. The water is still moving through it. Dr. Elaine N identified a set of specific things that tend to push the highly sensitive person past that peak sooner than others. They are ordinary, unremarkable things, the kind you encounter without choosing any of them. Caffeine. Even a small amount can tip the finely tuned system into a range of alertness that is hard to come back from. What gives someone else a pleasant afternoon lift can leave the highly sensitive person buzzing at an uncomfortable frequency for hours. Hunger. The body's need for fuel, unmet, becomes louder for the sensitive nervous system. A missed meal is not just a mild inconvenience, it becomes something the whole organism feels insistently, crowding out other things, making the world harder to bear. Bright light. The harsh overhead fluorescence of a supermarket or an open-plan office, the sudden brightness of stepping outside after a dim room. These are things the sensitive system registers with more intensity. Not because the eyes themselves are different, but because the brain processes the signal more thoroughly, finds more in it, lingers over it longer. Loud noise, the same concert, the same crowded restaurant, the same open office with its ambient chorus of voices and phones and chairs on floors. For the highly sensitive person, this is not background, it is foreground, all of it, all at once. Strong smells, a particular perfume in an enclosed space, the exhaust from a passing bus, the synthetic vanilla of a scented candle in a small room. Again, not a flaw of the nose, but a thoroughness of the processing. The signal comes in and the brain holds on to it, examines it, follows its threads, being watched, being evaluated. This one is quieter, but it runs deep. When the highly sensitive person knows they are being observed, in a performance review, a job interview, a first meeting, a conversation where they sense they are being assessed, the added layer of self-monitoring that comes with that awareness stacks on top of everything else the system is already carrying. And the Yerkes-Dodson peak, already closer than it is for others, comes closer still. None of these things is a crisis in itself. In the right circumstances, in small doses, they may not register as difficulties at all, but stacked together, built up over hours, pressed into the narrow spaces of a full and ordinary day, they accumulate. And by the time evening comes, by the time the world has finally gone a little quieter around you, there is a kind of residue, a weight that is not quite tiredness and not quite sadness and not quite anxiety, but something of all three, the aftermath of a nervous system that has been running at capacity since it opened its eyes this morning. This is what it means to be flooded. And this, only this, is the explanation, not a character weakness, not a failure of resilience, not evidence that you should toughen up or push through or train yourself out of it. Simply the natural consequence of a depth of processing that costs more to sustain. You were doing more than the people around you all day long. Of course the cost was higher. Take a breath, let that settle for a moment. Because now we turn to the next thing, and this is the part that changes the shape of everything. We have been talking about the inner machinery of the sensitive person, the processing, the depth, the faster saturation, and all of that lives concretely, materially, in the brain. Not as a story, not as a self-concept, in the living structure of the brain itself. And in 2014, a researcher named Bianca Acevedo did something that allowed us to see this with a clarity that had not quite existed before. She brought highly sensitive people and less sensitive people into a brain scanner. A functional MRI scanner, the kind that measures blood flow through the brain in real time, that shows, with the precision of modern imaging, which regions of the brain are most active as a person thinks and feels and responds to what is in front of them. And she showed them photographs. The photographs were of faces, strangers' faces and the faces of people close to them. Happy faces, sad faces, neutral faces. And as the people in the scanner looked at these images, the scanner recorded what happened inside their brains. Which regions lit up? How brightly? Which parts of the brain were working hardest as the person processed what they saw? In the highly sensitive people, two areas stood out with particular clarity. The first was the insula. The insula is a structure tucked inside the brain, folded beneath the outer surface, and if you were looking for a single region to hand the label the place where you feel things, the insula would have a strong claim. It is involved in what researchers call interoception, the brain's awareness of the body's own internal state. The heartbeat, the breath, the subtle physical sensations that accompany emotion. It is involved in empathy, in the recognition of what another person is feeling. It is involved in the integration of incoming information from inside and outside the body, the weaving together of the world as experienced and the self that is experiencing it. Some researchers have called the insula the seat of consciousness, and that is a large claim, but it is not an empty one. When you feel something, truly feel it. Not just think about it, but feel it in your chest, in your throat, in the quality of the air around you. The insula is almost certainly part of what is happening. And in the highly sensitive people, in Bianca Acevedo's study, when they were looking at the faces of people they loved, the insula was more active, more blood flowing through it, more work being done. The feeling was not a figure of speech. It was there, lighting up in the scanner, measurable and real. The second area was the mirror neuron system. Mirror neurons are among the more remarkable things neuroscience has found inside the human brain. These are cells that activate not only when you perform an action, but when you observe someone else performing that same action. They are, in a sense, the cells of resonance. When you watch someone reach for a glass of water, the same neurons that would fire if you were reaching for it yourself are partially activated in you. When you see someone wince in pain, something corresponding happens in the neural pathways that register your own pain. And in the highly sensitive people, when they were looking at the faces of their loved ones, expressions of happiness, expressions of sadness, the mirror neuron system was more activated than in the less sensitive participants. Their brains were not simply recognizing an emotion on a face, they were resonating with it, lighting up in something like a reflection of what the other person felt. This is the deeply feeling, deeply thinking brain, not as a description, not as a metaphor borrowed from poetry, as a biological fact. The insula more active, the mirror neuron system more active, the whole architecture of emotional awareness running at a higher register. And now think about what this means for an ordinary afternoon. You sit across from a friend who says the words, "I'm fine," but whose eyes have gone somewhere else. You notice, not because you are nosy or because you have trained yourself to be perceptive, but because the mirror neurons have already begun to resonate with the thing she isn't saying. Something in you registers the gap between the words and the face, and it registers it before you have consciously decided to pay attention. It comes through the way a signal comes through a well-tuned receiver. You sit in a meeting and you feel the shift in the room before anyone has spoken about what shifted. Something in the dynamic has changed, a small tension, a faint disappointment, something that hasn't yet found words. You feel the edge of it. Others may notice it eventually, or they may not notice it at all, but you felt it now, in the room, in your body, in the insula that is always reading the room. You watch a film alone, in the dark, and when the character you have come to love loses something, the loss moves through you. not as sympathy, a mild, understanding nod from a distance, but as something close to grief. The mirror neurons have been with that character across the whole film, partially activating with every expression, every gesture, every small flicker of feeling on the screen. And when the grief arrives, you feel it, something like feeling it. This is the empathy that the highly sensitive person carries. Not learned, not performed, not the result of making a special effort to be kind. Simply the way the wiring runs. And it is extraordinary. But it is also, again, costly. Because the same system that lets you feel a friend's sadness before she speaks of it is also the system that makes you absorb the heaviness of a crowded room, the low-grade stress of a difficult meeting, the collective anxiety of a hard news day. The resonance does not sort, it does not select only the pleasant emotions to mirror and set aside the rest. It catches what is in the air. And what is in the air is not always light. By the end of a day spent among other people, among the small emotional weather systems that every human being carries around them, the highly sensitive person has been in some way living all of those emotional climates simultaneously. The colleague's frustration, the stranger's grief visible in their eyes on the subway, the mild hostility of an interaction that didn't quite go well, the bright pleasure of a moment that surprised you, the quiet sadness of an overheard conversation in a hallway, all of it came in. All of it went through the insula, through the mirror neurons, through the deep processing that does not skim but stays with things. And this is why the evening is heavy, sometimes, for reasons you cannot quite name. It is not your grief, exactly, and it is not your frustration, and it is not your anxiety alone. You have been holding the resonances of the day. You have been carrying what came through. And the body, wise and tired and finally still, does not always know how to set it down. Let us hold that for a moment. There is something in here that the world rarely says plainly. When we talk about sensitivity, when someone is called too sensitive or told they feel things too deeply, or gently advised to develop a thicker skin, what is being implied, usually without anyone meaning harm, is that the feeling is a problem, that the sensitivity of the insula, the liveliness of the mirror neurons, the depth of processing that notices and resonates and stays with things, that all of this is a malfunction, something to correct, to train away, to protect yourself from, but it is not a malfunction. Bianca Acevedo showed us that the brain in the scanner is not a broken brain. It is a brain that feels more, that resonates more, that does more with the emotional and sensory information the world provides, that the doing of more costs more is real, and the cost deserves acknowledgement. But the brain itself is not broken. The feeling is not a flaw. It is a feature of a particular kind of wiring, the kind that makes certain people the ones others call when they need to feel understood, the kind that makes certain artists and certain caregivers and certain teachers irreplaceable, the kind that can walk into a room and sense what the room needs before it has been asked. And the fourth pillar of the trait sits right here as the natural companion to everything the imaging showed. Sensitivity to subtle stimuli, not the dramatic, the loud, the obvious, the faint, the fine, the thing that is almost there. The highly sensitive person notices the subtle shift in a friend's voice at the beginning of a phone call before anything has been said about how they are. The way the light in a room changes at a particular hour of the afternoon. The faint smell of rain in the air 40 minutes before the rain actually comes. The slight tension in someone's shoulders when they say a word they are uncertain about. The note in a piece of music that does not resolve the way the other notes resolve. The one that sits uneasily on top of the chord, asking a question the melody doesn't answer. These are not things the highly sensitive person goes looking for. They are not the result of effort. The noticing simply happens because the processing that happens at the deeper levels of the brain does not wait for instruction. It catches what comes through the senses and turns it over, relates it to what has come before, checks it against what was expected. And when the unexpected is there, the slight mismatch, the small change, the faint signal that something is different, it finds it. Jadzia Jagielowicz's imaging work from 2011 showed this directly. When highly sensitive people were given the task of detecting subtle changes in scenes, the regions of their brains associated with higher order processing, the areas that relate new input to past experience, that build context and catch fine detail, were more active than in the less sensitive participants. They were doing more with what their eyes brought in. The signal moved further into the brain was handled by more of it before it was resolved into recognition. This is why, when something has shifted and no one else in the room seems to have noticed, you noticed. Not because your eyes are better, but because the machinery behind your eyes does not stop where most people's does. And this noticing is one of the quiet gifts that runs through the trait. The person who catches the thing before it becomes a problem, who hears the slight edge in a friend's voice and asks gently, "Are you all right?" and means it, and waits for the answer. Who walks into a place and knows, without quite knowing how they know, whether it is safe and warm or whether something has gone wrong here? Who reads a room the way a skilled musician reads a score, not only the notes written out loud and clear, but the rests between them, the dynamic markings, the instructions written small in the margins that tell you not just what to play, but how. The sensitivity to subtle stimuli is in this sense a form of intelligence, not the only form, not the superior form, but a real one, a capacity for the detection of signal in the noise that most of the world is moving too fast to catch. But here too there is a cost, because the highly sensitive person does not choose which subtle stimuli to notice. The capacity does not come with a filter that says, this subtle thing matters, that subtle thing is irrelevant, process one and leave the other. It catches everything subtle. The meaningful and the meaningless, the signal and the noise that looks like signal. The faint smell that means rain is also the faint smell of the cleaning products in the grocery store. The ability to sense a friend's mood before they speak is also the ability to absorb a stranger's barely visible irritation at the supermarket checkout. The ear that catches the wrong note in a piece of music is also the ear that cannot stop catching the particular pitch of the refrigerator humming in the kitchen at midnight. This is the architecture of the trait, all four pillars together, the deep processing, the faster over-arousal, the stronger emotional resonance, the catching of subtle stimuli on tin. They are not four separate things, they are one thing looked at from four sides. They are the natural consequences of a nervous system that is oriented toward depth. And that nervous system is here with you now, in this bed, in this quiet. Think about the day it has had. Every light and sound and temperature and smell, every face and voice and mood and shift, every detail of every conversation, the words said and the things beneath the words, every transition from one environment to another, each one requiring its own adjustment, its own recalibration of the arousal level, its own effort to settle. Every piece of news that came through a screen carrying its own emotional freight. Every moment of being observed, of being in motion, of navigating the density of other people and their needs and their weather. The net was cast wide all day long. It caught everything it touched, and now it is night. And the world has finally, blessedly, grown quieter around you. And the question the body is asking gently and insistently is whether you can let some of it go, whether you can put the net down. The answer is yes. That is what this night is for. Let us pause here for a little while. Take a slow, deep breath in. Let it fill you. and then let it go, unhurried, all the way out. And with it, if you can, let some of the weight of the day come loose. Not by force, not by deciding to stop feeling things, simply by letting the breath carry you very slowly toward the quiet that is already here, waiting for you on the other side of all that processing. Notice your body against the surface beneath you, the small pressure points where you are held, the temperature of the air where it meets your skin. Notice, without needing to do anything about it, how much your body knows about rest. It has been resting itself for as long as you have been alive. It knows the shape of it. You do not need to instruct it or convince it or push it towards sleep. You only need to let it do what it already knows how to do. And in a little while, when you are ready, we will go on together into the part of the story that changes how you see the trait itself, into what the evolutionary record says about why it has survived and what it tells us about you. But for now, there is nothing you need to carry. The net can rest in the water. The water can be still. And you can let it. When the researchers who study this trait want to explain why a sensitive person saturates faster than someone nearby, why the same concert that leaves one friend glowing with energy leaves you wrung out and ready for a week of silence, they reach for a curve. It is called the Yerkes-Dodson curve, named for two psychologists who described it over a century ago, and its shape is simple enough that you can hold it in your mind right now, in the dark. Imagine a hill. On the left-hand slope, as stimulation rises, so does performance. A little pressure sharpens you, a little noise wakes the brain, a little urgency brings things into focus. This is the familiar territory where a deadline helps, where the mild buzz of a coffee shop can make you productive, where a degree of challenge is simply what engagement feels like. The top of the hill is the optimal zone. Alert, capable, present, and then the right-hand slope falls away. Past that peak, more stimulation stops helping and begins to cost. The brain, asked to process more than it can integrate cleanly, starts to fragment. Decisions become harder, patience thins. The sense of being flooded, that word that so many sensitive people reach for instinctively, is not a metaphor. It is a description of a nervous system that has traveled over the hill and is now on the descent. Every human being has this curve. That is the important thing to hold first. This is not a sensitivity-specific failure. The arc is universal. The difference, and here is the heart of it, the mechanism that explains so much, is where, on the horizontal axis, your peak sits. What level of incoming stimulation exactly brings you to the top of that hill? And for people high in sensory processing sensitivity, the peak comes sooner. Not because they are weaker, not because there is a flaw in the wiring, but because depth of processing is itself a form of work. To take information and relate it to past experience, to notice the emotional texture of a conversation, to register the low hum of the air conditioning and the slight change in a colleague's posture and the quality of light in the room, to do all of that simultaneously and carefully, that is metabolically and cognitively costly. The depth is the gift. The overstimulation is the cost of the gift. They are not separate things. Dr. Elaine N, whose foundational research established sensory processing sensitivity as a construct, named overstimulation as the second pillar of the trait, the O in the Dobbs framework. And she was careful, always, to frame it this way. Not as a malfunction, but as a consequence. The same thoroughness that makes a sensitive person a careful thinker, a perceptive friend, a conscientious worker, is the very mechanism that fills the cup faster under pressure. The triggers are specific and worth naming because recognition is itself a small form of relief. Caffeine tends to push the sensitive nervous system up the arousal curve faster and higher than it does for others. Hunger is not just mild discomfort. It is a signal that arrives sooner and carries more urgency. Bright light, particularly the cold, hard light of overhead fluorescence, registers as more intrusive. Loud noise is not merely unpleasant but genuinely disorienting when it is sustained. Strong smells, the cleaning product someone used in the hallway, the perfume worn by someone standing close, arrive with a force that others simply do not experience. And being watched, being evaluated, being on in some social sense, carries a cost that goes beyond ordinary self-consciousness. The eyes of others are a form of input too. A loud day for a highly sensitive person is not just a loud day, it is a day in which all of these channels were opened simultaneously, each one feeding data into a brain that was already working hard to integrate what it received. By evening, the saturation is real. It is not drama and it is not weakness. It is a nervous system that did an enormous amount of work and needs now the one thing that work always eventually requires: rest. But before we arrive there is something else to understand about this wiring, something that the imaging studies have made visible in a way that no self-report measure fully could. In 2014, a neuroscientist named Bianca Acevedo led a study that placed people high and low in sensory processing sensitivity inside a functional MRI scanner. What the researchers wanted to know was whether the emotional sensitivity that HSPs consistently report, the feeling that others' moods move through them, that a stranger's distress is genuinely felt, that a loved one's face carries a particular weight, whether that was reflected anywhere in the actual activity of the brain, whether the deeply feeling person was deeply feeling in a measurable biological sense. They showed participants photographs, strangers, and then faces of people they loved. When the faces of the people they loved appeared on the screen, something happened in the brains of the highly sensitive participants that did not happen to the same degree in the others. The insula lit up. The insula is a region of the brain folded deep within the cortex, and its functions are remarkable. It is involved in interoception, the sense of what is happening inside your own body, the felt sense of self, the awareness of your own heartbeat and breath, and the subtle signals of your internal state. It is also deeply involved in empathy, in the processing of emotional experience, in what researchers sometimes call visceral awareness. Some have described it not inaccurately as the place where feeling is felt, the seat of the sense that something matters. And in the brains of highly sensitive people, when they looked at the faces of those they loved, the insula was more active, measurably, visibly more active. This is not a small finding. It is not a self-report on a questionnaire that someone might answer hopefully or anxiously. It is brain tissue, metabolizing, responding, processing. The deeply feeling brain is not a turn of phrase. It is a description of something that happens inside the skull that can be seen. The mirror neuron system also showed heightened activation. This is the network of neurons thought to be involved in the understanding of others' actions and emotions, the neural machinery that underlies, at least in part, the capacity to imagine from the inside what someone else is experiencing. When a highly sensitive person watches someone they love register pain or joy or uncertainty, the brain areas associated with experiencing those states themselves activate more strongly. The sensitivity is not imagination in the loose sense, it is resonance in a neurological sense. Acevedo and her colleagues describe this as the deeply feeling, deeply thinking brain. And what I want you to hear in that phrase, here in the quiet, is that it is not a critique, it is a portrait. You were not taught to feel more. You were not raised to be overwhelmed. The brain you are resting with tonight has a particular architecture, one that is measurable and real, one that makes empathy not a practice, but a condition of how you perceive the world. The third pillar of the trait, sensitivity to subtle stimuli, follows from this same architecture, and it is worth a moment of recognition before we rest in it. When a sensitive person notices the faint smell of rain before anyone else mentions it, or catches the slight flattening in a friend's voice that signals something is wrong before a word has been said about it, or registers that the atmosphere in a room has shifted in some way that others will take another 20 minutes to notice, this is not superior sensory hardware. The ears are not more sensitive in any physiological sense. The eyes have the same rods and cones. The nose has the same receptors. What is different is what happens after the signal arrives. The signal is received by everyone in roughly the same way. What a highly sensitive person does with it is process it more fully, relate it more widely, compare it against a richer internal map of what has come before. The noticing is downstream of the processing. The subtlety detected is a consequence of depth applied to input that others set aside. And this is the thread that runs through all four pillars together: depth, saturation, empathy, subtle awareness, a single underlying mechanism expressing itself in four directions at once. Rest in that for a moment. The same architecture. Four different faces of it, each recognizable, each connected to the others by the same root. Take a slow breath. Let the body settle a little more. There is no urgency here, no test to pass. We are simply understanding together something that has been true of you perhaps your entire life. When you are ready, we will continue. And where we go next takes us back much further than 1997, much further than Elaine Aron's laboratory, much further than brain scanners and scales and peer-reviewed journals. It takes us back to the question that sits underneath all of this science. The question that once answered tends to change everything. Why does this trait exist at all? If high sensitivity means reaching overwhelm faster, needing more time to recover, being more affected by difficulty and conflict and noise, then from a certain angle it looks like a disadvantage. It looks like something natural selection would have gradually filtered out. And yet here it is, documented in roughly 15 to 30% of human beings, depending on how you measure it, and documented, this is the part that stops most people, in more than 100 other species. More than 100: fruit flies, fish, birds, primates, rats, deer. The list of species in which researchers have found a subset of individuals who respond to environmental input more carefully, more completely, more slowly than others in their own population keeps growing. A group of researchers, including Marcus Wolf and others, writing in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2008, traced this responsiveness strategy across the animal kingdom and found the same pattern recurring independently across wildly different branches of life. Some members of a population pause and look more carefully before acting. Others act faster. Both strategies persist. Neither eliminates the other. That persistence is the key. In evolutionary terms, if a trait has survived for this long, across this many species, it is not an accident, and it is not a flaw. It has been tested by time in a way that dwarfs any human experiment. The fruit fly colony that has survived for 10,000 generations contains, in every generation, some individuals who are more reactive to environmental change and some who are less. Those more reactive individuals have not been bred out. The sensitive ones did not disappear. There is a reason for that. To understand the reason, it helps to think about what a population needs to do in order to survive over long spans of time. It does not need every member to behave identically. What it needs is range. It needs some members who are optimized for speed and action under ordinary conditions, and some members who are optimized for reading the environment carefully and catching the signals that others miss. Imagine, if you will, a small community living at the edge of a forest. The majority of the community goes about the day's ordinary work, gathering, building, caring for one another, without stopping every few minutes to assess the quality of the light or the direction of a sound. This is efficient. Most of the time, ordinary caution is enough. But there are a few among them who notice things. One of them pauses at the edge of the clearing and registers that the birds have gone quiet in a particular direction. One of them catches an unfamiliar smell carried on the wind before it becomes strong enough for others to detect. One of them notices that the quality of the water has changed very slightly before anyone has yet fallen ill. These individuals do not process the world faster. They process it more thoroughly, and occasionally, not always, but occasionally, that thorough processing catches something that changes what happens next. Elaine N and her colleagues, reviewing this evolutionary evidence in their 2012 paper in Personality and Social Psychology Review, used a phrase for these individuals that I find quietly perfect: the scout and the sentinel, the one who reads the environment, the one who notices the subtle threat and equally the subtle opportunity, the particular patch of earth where something might grow, the route that seems slightly safer, the stranger whose body language suggests something other than what their words convey. The scout and the sentinel do not exist in opposition to the rest of the community. They are part of its architecture. They are what allows a population to hold in balance the efficiency of routine and the vigilance of careful reading. They are, in a specific and measurable evolutionary sense, an asset. This means something important. The trait that leaves you flooded after a loud, demanding day is not a malfunction. It is not an error that crept into your blueprint. It is a strategy, an ancient strategy tested across hundreds of millions of years of living things navigating environments that were uncertain and complex and never entirely predictable. Your nervous system is doing something that natural selection has kept deliberately in every generation of almost every species complex enough to have a nervous system worth speaking of. That is not fragility. Breathe in and let that thought settle somewhere a little deeper than your thinking mind. You do not need to examine it. Just let it rest there. Now, if the evolutionary record tells us that this trait has persisted because it is useful, the next question is, where did it come from in you specifically? When did it begin? The answer, for most highly sensitive people, is at the beginning. Before you had a name for it. Before you had language for the experience at all. In the 1980s and 1990s, a developmental psychologist at Harvard named Jerome Kagan began one of the most careful, longitudinal studies of infant temperament that had ever been conducted. Kagan was interested in a particular question. Are some babies born with a more reactive nervous system? And if so, what does that reactivity look like as those children grow? To find out, he and his colleagues observed hundreds of infants at 4 months old. They showed these babies novel stimuli, colored mobiles, unusual sounds, the smell of something unfamiliar, and they watched how each baby responded. Some babies, roughly 80 to 85%, registered the stimulus with mild interest or mild protest and returned to baseline fairly quickly. Their nervous systems noted the novelty and set it aside, but roughly 15 to 20% of the babies did something different. Their arms and legs moved more, their backs arched slightly, they cried more readily. They did not, as Kagan put it, settle the novelty quickly. Their systems continued processing it, continuing to engage with it, as though the arrival of something unfamiliar warranted more attention than a brief assessment could provide. Kagan called these infants high reactive. And then he followed them, not for a few months, for years. He returned to these children at various points in their development, at 2, at 4, at 7, at adolescence, and he tracked what happened to the high reactive babies as they moved through the world. He published his findings eventually in a book called The Long Shadow of Temperament, and the shadow he described was not a dark one in the sense of a doom or a sentence. It was a shadow in the sense of a shape that traveled with a person, cast by something real and consistent in their biology. The high reactive infants, as children and as adolescents, tended to be more cautious in unfamiliar situations. They tended to take longer to warm up in new social environments. They noticed more. They were moved more easily by the emotional quality of a situation. When something frightened them, it frightened them more. When something delighted them, it delighted them more. Kagan was careful, scrupulously careful, to distinguish this from damage or pathology. These children were not broken. They had not been traumatized into their caution. They had been born into it. The reactivity was visible in the first months of life, before the world had had time to teach them very much of anything. It was constitutional. It was, in the deepest sense, innate. And here is the thread that connects Kagan's nursery to Aron's laboratory. Those high reactive infants, grown to adulthood, are what we are calling highly sensitive people. The scale changes. The vocabulary changes. The biological signature remains. There is something quietly settling about that, I think. To know that the sensitivity did not arrive because of something that went wrong. That it was not inflicted or learned or chosen. That it was there, measurably, before you were old enough to make any choices at all. You came into the world this way. You came into the world already noticing more, already processing more, already carrying a nervous system tuned to a slightly finer register than the one most people carry. And you are not alone in having come into the world this way. Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist whose ideas about the inner life have shaped so much of how we talk about personality, wrote, in his own language and his own era, about what he called innate sensitiveness. He observed that some people arrived at experience with a particular quality of inner attunement, a fineness of response to both the external world and the interior one that was not taught and not chosen. He was working without the brain scanning technology and the longitudinal studies that would come decades later. But he was describing something he kept encountering in his patients and in his own careful observation of human beings, a quality of being more fully present to what is happening, at some cost in composure and some gain in depth. The language is different, the era is different. The underlying observation is the same. Take a slow breath now, settle the weight of yourself a little more into where you are resting. There is something I want to say before we move on, and it is worth saying slowly. Everything we have covered so far, the depth of processing, the faster saturation, the empathy that is neural, not just habitual, the subtle noticing, the evolutionary record, the innate and early nature of the trait, all of it has been, in a sense, the mechanics, the what and the how, and the since when. But none of it has yet addressed the question that most highly sensitive people carry with them, often for years, sometimes for decades, before finding language for it. And that question is not really about brain regions or evolutionary strategies. The question is this: is something wrong with me? The world has many ways of asking that question back to a sensitive person. It asks it in the classroom, where a child cries more easily than the others and is asked to settle down. It asks it in the workplace, where the capacity for nuance is sometimes read as indecision. It asks it in the moment after a long day, when everyone else seems fine and you are not fine, and the not fineness is just there, quiet and exhausting and hard to name. It asks it in 100 small ways across a life, and the science has an answer. It is not a complicated answer, but it is one that tends to require some sitting with, because it asks you to revise a picture of yourself that may have been building since you were very young. The answer is this: not only is nothing wrong with you, but the very quality you have been treating as a liability is, depending on the conditions you're in, more accurately described as an advantage. Let me take you to that slowly. In the late 1990s and 2000s, a developmental psychologist named Belsky began working on a theory that would eventually reframe how researchers understand the relationship between sensitive temperament and outcome. Belsky had spent years studying how early environments affect children's development, and he had noticed something that troubled the conventional model. The conventional model, what researchers called the diathesis stress model, held that sensitive or reactive temperament was a kind of vulnerability. In this view, sensitive children were more likely to be harmed by difficult environments. Sensitivity was a risk factor. The recommendation, implicitly or explicitly, was to protect sensitive children from stress because their sensitivity made them more susceptible to damage. Belsky's observation was that this only told half the story. He noticed, looking across studies of children in different environments, that the sensitive children did indeed do worse in harsh or unsupportive conditions. The conventional model got that part right. But the same sensitive children, not different sensitive children, the same ones, did notably better in supportive, warm, enriching conditions than their less sensitive peers. The sensitivity was not just a vulnerability to negative input, it was a heightened responsiveness to all input. Bad environments affected sensitive people more. Good environments affected them more too. He named this differential susceptibility. The idea was that these individuals were not fragile in a one-directional sense. They were differentially susceptible, more permeable in both directions to the quality of the environment around them. They were, as Belsky put it, for better and for worse. This was a significant shift. It meant that the trait was not a wound waiting to happen. It was a kind of tuning, a finer calibration of the organism's relationship to its surroundings. A highly sensitive person in a supportive environment, with relationships that feel safe and conditions that allow for depth and care and adequate recovery, does not just cope as well as others. In many cases, they flourish more. Michael Pluess, a researcher who has extended and refined this work considerably, introduced the term Vantage Sensitivity to describe the positive side of this bidirectional responsiveness. Vantage sensitivity is the capacity to benefit more from positive experience and positive intervention than most people do. It is not a different trait from the sensitivity that causes difficulty and overwhelm. It is the same trait looking in the other direction. Pluess and colleagues have found evidence for Vantage sensitivity in studies of psychological interventions, programs designed to support children's mental health, to reduce anxiety, to build resilience. Highly sensitive participants in these programs consistently showed greater benefit than their less sensitive peers. When the input was good, their systems absorbed it more completely, integrated it more deeply, and showed more change. The depth of processing that costs so much under adverse conditions delivers more under supportive ones. I want to stay with this for a moment because it matters. If you have spent years treating your sensitivity primarily as something to manage, something that makes ordinary life harder than it should be, something to apologize for, or explain away or compensate for, the Vantage sensitivity research asks you to consider a different frame. Not a naive frame, not a denial of the cost. The cost is real. The saturation after a long, difficult day is real. The exhaustion that comes from processing everything more deeply than most people process anything is real. But the frame it asks you to try is this: you are not fragile, you are responsive. And the responsiveness works in both directions. The same wiring that leaves you flooded by difficulty leaves you more nourished by kindness, more moved by beauty, more changed by good experience. You are not a vessel with a crack in it. You are a vessel with thinner walls, and thin walls let more in from every direction. The orchid is not a failed dandelion. The orchid is built for a different relationship with its environment. And in the right environment, the orchid does something the dandelion cannot. This is what W. Thomas Boyce and Bruce Ellis found when they developed what became known as the orchid and dandelion hypothesis. Some children, the majority, like dandelions, are fairly resilient across a range of environments. They do reasonably well in adversity and reasonably well in ease. Their systems are calibrated for robustness. Others, the orchids, are more exquisitely sensitive to the quality of the environment around them. In difficult, neglectful, or harsh conditions, they show more negative outcomes than their dandelion peers, but in warm, supportive, enriching conditions, they show more positive outcomes. They bloom in ways that dandelions simply cannot bloom, because a dandelion's robustness across conditions is purchased at the cost of the orchid's exquisite responsiveness to conditions. Neither is superior, both are useful. A garden with only orchids is fragile. A garden with only dandelions is perhaps less beautiful than it could be. Francesca Leonetti and her colleagues, publishing in the journal Translational Psychiatry in 2018, took this framework and applied it to data from large populations, and what they found added a layer of nuance to the earlier picture. Rather than a clean binary, sensitive people and not sensitive people, the data suggested something more like three groups. There were the dandelions, roughly 25 to 35% of people, low sensitivity, robust across conditions. There were the orchids, also roughly 25 to 35%, high sensitivity, highly responsive to environmental quality. And then there was a middle group that Leonetti's team, carrying the botanical metaphor forward, called tulips. The largest single group, somewhere around 40 to 47%. Not the most sensitive, not the least. Sensitive enough to be noticeably affected by their environments, steady enough not to be easily overwhelmed. Tulips flourish in a range of conditions but bloom most fully in good soil. So the older figure you may have encountered, the one that says roughly 15 to 20% of people are highly sensitive, was not wrong exactly. It described the orchid group. What Leonetti's work added was the tulip group, the middle, and a more complete picture of how sensitivity distributes across a human population. It is not a rare trait. In the broadest sense, roughly a third of all people sit somewhere on the more sensitive end of the spectrum, and if you are listening to this tonight, in whatever quiet place you have made for yourself, there is a reasonable chance that you are somewhere on that end. The very fact of wanting, at the end of a long day, to settle into something slow and gentle and unhurried, to let language wash over you rather than demand anything from you, is itself a signal of a nervous system that knows what it needs. Let us rest here for a moment. Take a slow breath. Notice the place where your body makes contact with where you are resting, the weight of it, the slight warmth of it. You do not need to hold any of this carefully. You do not need to file it anywhere or remember the names or recite the percentages. You are just listening. You are just here. And the story is still here with you. When you are ready, we will continue. The next thread I want to follow is one that tends to produce what I can only describe as a quiet exhale in people who have been living with this trait for a long time without fully understanding it. It is the thread of what the science has found carefully and repeatedly about where the trait is not. Because one of the ways the world has gotten high sensitivity wrong, consistently and consequentially wrong, is by mapping it onto categories it does not actually belong to. And when a person spends years believing they are one thing when they are actually another, there is a cost to that misidentification, a cost in self-understanding, in the choices they make about how to live, in the explanations they reach for when something is difficult. So let us be clear, gently and specifically, about what sensory processing sensitivity is not. It is not introversion. This is perhaps the most common conflation, and it is understandable. Highly sensitive people often need time alone to recover. They tend to find overstimulating social environments exhausting. They are often drawn to depth over breadth in their relationships and their thinking. These things overlap loosely with common descriptions of introversion. But Elaine Aron's own data, going back to the foundational 1997 study, showed something that many people find genuinely surprising. Roughly 30% of highly sensitive people are extroverts, 3 in 10. Not a negligible minority, not an edge case. 3 in 10 highly sensitive people draw their energy from social interaction, enjoy the company of others, and orient naturally toward the world outside their own interior. They are social, they are warm, they like people, and they are also highly sensitive, which means they like people, and they are exhausted by sustained social exposure more quickly than their less sensitive friends. They want more connection, and they reach their limit sooner. The push and the pull are both real. Neither cancels the other out. Introversion and extroversion are about where you draw energy and how you orient to social stimulation. High sensitivity is about the depth at which you process sensory and emotional information and the speed at which you saturate. They are related traits. They share some variance, as researchers say, but they are distinct constructs. You can be introverted and not highly sensitive. You can be highly sensitive and not introverted. The categories do not map onto each other cleanly, and treating them as synonyms leads to misunderstanding both. The sensitive extrovert, as a figure in the literature, is particularly worth recognizing because theirs is often a particularly confusing experience. They are drawn out into the world by genuine warmth and social appetite, and then found wanting in some way they cannot easily name, not antisocial, not shy, not misanthropic, but overwhelmed in a way that does not quite match what they know about themselves. The difficulty is not with people. The difficulty is with the volume of experience that being with people generates in a nervous system that processes everything, including the social, more deeply than average. If that description reaches something in you tonight, let it land gently. It does not require a response. High sensitivity is also not the same as shyness, though the two are sometimes confused. Shyness is a learned caution in social situations, often rooted in past experiences of social discomfort or evaluation anxiety. It is acquired. It changes with time and circumstance and repeated exposure to safe social settings. A shy person can, through experience, become much less shy. High sensitivity is innate. It was there in Kagan's infants at 4 months, before social experience had much of a chance to shape it. Sensitivity and shyness can coexist in the same person, and sometimes do. But they are different in origin and different in what responds to them. High sensitivity is also not neuroticism, though this conflation is important to address because it carries a particular weight. Neuroticism, in the personality research tradition, is a tendency toward negative affect, anxiety, worry, emotional instability, a general tilt toward difficulty. It is a real dimension of personality, and highly sensitive people do sometimes score higher on neuroticism measures, particularly when they have grown up in unsupportive environments or have experienced significant hardship. But the relationship between the two is complicated by context, not simple and causal. A sensitive person in a harsh environment may develop negative affect as a response to repeated, overwhelming experience. A sensitive person in a supportive environment in the research findings often does not. Sensitivity is not inherently negative in its emotional tone. It is amplified in its emotional range. That is a different thing. And because this distinction matters, and because confusion here can send people in genuinely unhelpful directions, high sensitivity is not the same as autism or sensory processing disorder. These are separate constructs with separate diagnostic criteria, separate neurological profiles, and separate implications for support and treatment. There is surface overlap in some presentations. Both can involve sensitivity to sensory input. Both can involve difficulty with certain social environments. But they are not the same thing, and conflating them does a disservice to everyone involved. Sensory processing. Sensitivity is a normal trait present across the full range of otherwise neurotypical people. It is a dimension of temperament, not a disorder and not a clinical category. Aron and her colleagues, in their 2012 review, in Personality and Social Psychology Review, were careful and emphatic on this point. The trait is normal. It is a normal variation in how the human nervous system processes experience. It belongs on the same spectrum as height or reaction time or color perception. It varies, it is largely innate, and being at one end of it does not make you broken. It is worth saying that plainly without rushing past it. You are not broken. The wiring is particular. It is not broken. And the evidence worth holding on to, if you hold on to anything from this part of the night, is this. The same wiring that makes the hard days harder makes something else richer. The research, going back to the fMRI work of Bianca Acevedo and the differential susceptibility work of Belsky and Michael Pluess, is consistent on a point that tends to get left out of most popular discussions of this trait. The sensitivity is bidirectional. The reactivity is not a one-way door. The same neural architecture that activates more strongly when a highly sensitive person encounters distress also activates more strongly when they encounter beauty, more strongly when they encounter music that moves them, more strongly when they encounter a moment in nature that feels, somehow, like it is speaking to something inside them, more strongly when they encounter kindness offered without condition, or a piece of writing that articulates something they have felt but never found words for, or the specific quality of late afternoon light on water. These are not small things. They are, for many people, the things that make a life feel worth living. The moments of genuine contact with the world's capacity for wonder and meaning. And the sensitive person, by virtue of the trait that costs them on the hard days, gets more of those moments. Not metaphorically more, physiologically more. The insula is activated more deeply, the mirror system resonates more fully, the processing goes further. The instrument is tuned more finely. That means more signal from dissonance, and more signal from harmony. And tonight, here, now, lying in the quiet, the world has turned down a little of its volume. The ordinary flood of a day is no longer arriving. What remains is this: the hum of something restful, the particular texture of where you are, the slow progress of your own breathing, and perhaps the beginning of a kind of ease that a deeply processing mind sometimes takes a little longer to find than most minds do. That is all right. It is finding it. You are finding it. The breath slows, the body settles, the processing continues because it always continues. But the input has quieted, and when the input quiets, the processing can turn inward, not to catalogue or solve or review, but simply to integrate, to complete gently the work of the day, to set things in their places with care. This is what rest looks like for a nervous system like yours, not the flicking off of a switch, not the sudden silence of a mind that simply stops. Something slower and more organic than that, a gradual lowering of the water, a tide that moves out without urgency. You do not have to help it. You do not have to rush it. The instrument knows how to quiet itself when the world is quiet enough around it. Take a slow breath. Notice the weight of your limbs, the particular temperature of the air. The way sound, if there is any sound, seems to come from a little further away than it did a few minutes ago. You are here. The night is here. And there is one more thread we will follow when you are ready. A thread that runs from everything we have covered tonight back to this moment, to this bed, to this particular quality of quiet that a highly sensitive person sometimes needs more than others do, and sometimes arrives at more slowly, but not urgently, slowly, gently, when you are ready. There is something the world tends to assume about a person who feels things deeply. It assumes they must be a particular kind of person. Quiet, withdrawn, the one in the corner at the party, the one who prefers books to people, the one who finds crowds impossible because crowds require a kind of sociability they simply don't have. The world draws a line, smooth and confident, between the highly sensitive and the introverted, and it assumes they are the same line. They are not. This is worth saying clearly because the confusion does a real kind of harm. It narrows the story of sensitivity into a story about shyness, about retreat, about a person who has simply never been very comfortable with other people. And that story, however familiar it has become, is not what the science shows. Elaine Aron's own data from the original research that established this trait and gave it a name found that roughly 30% of highly sensitive people are extroverts, not ambiverts. Extroverts, people who genuinely draw energy from being around others, who feel more alive in company than alone, who want connection and stimulation and the warmth of a room full of people they care about. 30%. That is not a small asterisk. That is nearly a third of everyone who carries this trait. And it matters because if you are one of them, if you are someone who loves people and longs for company and also finds that after a full evening with the people you love, you arrive home feeling as though you have been turned inside out. The dominant story about sensitivity has no room for you. It would call you a contradiction. The science calls you exactly what you are, a highly sensitive extrovert, someone whose nervous system processes deeply and saturates faster, and who also genuinely and truly wants to be in the world with other people. The tension that creates is real. It is a push and pull that runs through a particular kind of life. The desire to be present and connected and engaged, alongside the exhaustion that follows being present and connected and engaged, the way the two things do not cancel each other out, but simply coexist, one not erasing the other, both true at once. If you have lived inside that tension and not known what to call it, or assumed it meant something was wrong with the way you were put together, you can set that down now. There is a name for it. There is a mechanism, and the mechanism is not a flaw. Introversion and sensitivity are related in the way that cousins are related. They share some family resemblance. They often appear together. They are sometimes confused for one another at a distance, but they are measuring different things. Introversion, in the way researchers and psychologists use the term, is about where a person draws energy, whether the social world replenishes them or depletes them, whether time alone restores something or costs something. Sensitivity is about depth of processing, about how much information the nervous system takes in and how thoroughly it works it through before arriving at a response. You can be introverted without being highly sensitive. You can be highly sensitive without being introverted. The two dimensions exist on separate axes, and a person can sit anywhere in that space. There are quiet, solitary, highly sensitive people, yes. And there are loud, warm, gregarious, deeply connected, highly sensitive people who will hug you at the door and talk until midnight and feel everything you say as though it lands directly in their chest. Both are real. Both belong here. The same kind of clarity is useful when it comes to shyness. Shyness is something different again. It is a fear of social judgment, an anxiety about how one is perceived, something that tends to develop through experience and environment, through early moments of feeling exposed or embarrassed or unwelcome. It can be unlearned, at least in part, because it was partly learned to begin with. Sensitivity is not learned. It is there from the beginning, from the very beginning, as Jerome Kagan's decades of research with infants made visible. Shyness is a response to a specific fear. Sensitivity is a way of being in the world. They are not the same thing, even when they sometimes look alike from the outside. And then there is neuroticism, a term from personality psychology that refers to a general tendency toward negative emotions, anxiety, emotional instability, the kind of reactivity that tilts heavily toward distress. High sensitivity does correlate with neuroticism to some degree in the statistics, but they are not the same construct and they do not travel together always or necessarily. A highly sensitive person is not inherently anxious or emotionally unstable. Their emotions run deep, yes. Their reactions are stronger, yes. But deep and strong is not the same as disordered or troubled. A cello string vibrating at full resonance is not a broken string. The richness of the sound is not evidence of damage. There is also the matter of autism spectrum conditions and of what researchers call sensory processing disorder. These come up when sensitivity is discussed because they share a surface, a certain kind of overwhelm in loud or bright or complicated environments, a certain kind of noticing, a certain sense of the world as more intense than others seem to find it. But these are distinct from sensory processing sensitivity in important and careful ways. Autism involves differences in social communication, in how the mind builds its model of other people and their inner lives, differences that run far deeper and wider than the trait we are describing tonight. Sensory processing disorder involves disruption of how sensory information is integrated in ways that interfere significantly with daily function. Sensory processing. Sensitivity is a normal variation in temperament, not a disorder, not in any clinical manual, not something that requires diagnosis or treatment, not something you need to be fixed from. The distinctions matter not to draw sharp lines of exclusion, but because accuracy is kindness. Calling yourself one thing when you are another doesn't help you understand yourself, and understanding yourself is exactly what tonight is for. One more piece of the picture worth naming. This trait does not favor one gender over another. Elaine Aron's data shows the distribution of high sensitivity is roughly equal in men and women. It is not a woman's trait, not a feminine quality, not something that appears in one half of the population and leaves the other largely untouched. What differs is not prevalence, but reception. The cultures most of us grew up inside had particular ideas about what sensitivity was allowed to look like, and in whom. Boys and men who felt things deeply were often given messages, sometimes gentle, sometimes not gentle at all, that what they were feeling was too much, that they should be tougher, that the depth of their reaction was something to be hidden or overcome. The trait itself was there all along, equally distributed, equally real. What varied was how welcome it was, how much room it was given, how early the person learned to conceal or apologize for what they were. If you learned to apologize for it, if the word sensitive came to you first as a criticism, as something said about you that was meant to make you smaller, then some part of tonight is for that. The steady, unhurried work of understanding that what you were apologizing for was not a deficiency. It was a way of processing. It was a nervous system doing exactly what it was built to do. The apology was never required. Now. Here is the thread that connects everything. The thread that runs from the brain in the scanner to the orchid in the window to the 100 species that share this responsiveness strategy across the living world. Here is the thing that is hardest to hold all at once, but most important to let in. The same wiring does everything. Every part of what we have discussed tonight is one system. It is not that sensitivity carries some burdens, and separately some gifts. It is that the same depth of processing that floods you on a loud, demanding day is the exact mechanism that lets you feel a piece of music somewhere deep inside your chest, behind your ribs, in a place you cannot quite locate, but that you know when it opens. The same insula that burns bright on the scanner when you see the face of someone you love, the same region that makes the emotions of the people around you arrive to you as almost your own. That is not a different part of the sensitivity than the overwhelm. It is the same part, the same volume, turned up in every direction. There is a musician whose playing has always made you ache a little, in the best sense of that word. Some particular combination of notes that does something to the inside of your throat you cannot quite describe. There is a quality of light on a late afternoon in autumn that has, at some point in your life, stopped you without warning, just for a moment, just to be in it. There is a scene in a book, a line in a poem, a film you have watched twice because the first time you couldn't quite hold all of what it was doing to you and you wanted to go back and be in it again more slowly. There is someone's face, perhaps, someone you have loved or love still, and the way looking at it has sometimes felt like looking at something you couldn't quite take in all at once. This is the same nervous system. This is sensitivity pointing in the direction of beauty. The reactivity is bidirectional. It is not a dial that someone turned up only on the frequencies of difficulty and distress. It is a dial turned up across all frequencies. And among those frequencies are wonder and awe and the deep, specific pleasure of noticing, of being in a moment so completely that the moment feels larger than it did before you arrived in it. Researchers who have studied this find that highly sensitive people report being more deeply moved by music, by art, by natural beauty, by the experience of awe in general, not because they are performing it, not because they are trying to feel more than they feel, but because the processing goes deeper, and when what arrives is beautiful, the depth carries the beauty further in. It settles into the nervous system differently. It stays. This is why the reframe matters so much. The word sensitive in our culture has been used mostly as a description of cost. It has meant easily hurt. It has meant hard to be around. It has meant you take things too personally, you need to toughen up, you feel too much, and it makes the people around you uncomfortable. That version of the word is not the whole word. It is not even most of the word. The full word includes deeply moved, attuned, noticing, present to texture and nuance and the fine grain of things, capable of being stopped in your tracks by a particular quality of afternoon light, and knowing, even if only for a moment, that the fact of being here, inside this life, inside this body, in this particular season, is astonishing. That is the same nervous system. That is what you have. And now we come to the final thread, the one that leads back to this bed, to this room, to the work of tonight, specifically. Because understanding what you are is only part of the question. The rest of the question is, what does a nervous system like this one need in order to restore itself? The answer is not complicated, though it may be different from what the world has usually told you. Recovery for a deeply processing nervous system is not about pushing through. It is not about becoming someone who is less affected by things, someone who can sit in a noisy restaurant for 3 hours and emerge fresh and ready for the next thing. It is not about accumulating more tolerance, more toughness, more capacity to absorb stimulation without it touching you. That is a project aimed in the wrong direction. It asks the instrument to be something other than what it is, and instruments that are forced to be something other than what they are do not play better. They play worse, and eventually they break. The actual answer is simpler and more generous to yourself. Recovery is reducing the input. It is giving the processing system less to process, so that what it has already taken in can complete itself, settle, integrate, find its place. Overstimulation is the mechanism behind the depletion. The deep processing reaches saturation, the cost mounts, the system runs past its optimal working range. And so the repair is not more stimulation of any kind. It is quiet. It is low input. It is an environment that asks nothing of the nervous system except to be in it. Rachel and Stephen Kaplan, two environmental psychologists who built what they called attention restoration theory, spent years studying how environments affect mental fatigue, specifically the kind of fatigue that comes from sustained, directed, deliberate attention. the kind a deeply processing mind is doing, quietly, all the time. They found that certain kinds of environments restore depleted attention in ways that effortful environments cannot. And the most restorative environments share a particular quality, what the Kaplans called soft fascination. Soft fascination is the kind of attention a natural setting asks of you. A walk among trees, the movement of water, a sky that is doing something interesting, the way light comes through leaves. These things are interesting enough to hold the attention gently, to give the wandering mind something to rest against, but they ask nothing of you. They do not require decisions. They do not require evaluation or response or judgment. They simply are, and you can simply be in them. And the effect, which the Kaplans and later researchers measured carefully, is genuine restoration. The depleted, directed attention system replenishes. The fatigue lifts. The nervous system, having been given something that holds it softly without demanding anything, refills. For a brain that processes deeply and saturates faster than most, this is not a luxury, it is maintenance. The way you oil the mechanism, or rest the string, or let the soil lie fallow so it can grow again. Nature, in the Kaplan's work, is the prototype of a restorative environment. And practitioners who work with highly sensitive people have found that time in nature functions as one of the most reliable restorative levers available. But soft fascination can appear in many forms. A quiet room, rain against a window, low, unhurried music, the sound of your own breath in the dark. This room, this moment. There is also the matter of sleep itself and the particular relationship a deeply processing nervous system often has with the transition into sleep. Practitioners who work with highly sensitive people and surveys of HSPs themselves find a pattern that many will recognize: the need for more decompression before sleep, more time between the end of the stimulating world and the beginning of rest, more transition. A mind that processes deeply does not simply switch off when the day ends. It keeps working, quietly, on what the day contained. If the day was rich with input, the processing does not complete itself just because the clock reached a certain hour. It continues, running through what needs to be run through, placing what needs to be placed, finishing what it began. This is not insomnia precisely. It is not a malfunction. It is the mind doing its work on its own schedule, which tends to be a longer schedule than the world designs for. And what helps is not forcing it to stop, which doesn't work, but giving it conditions in which the work can complete more easily and more naturally. Removing the late-arriving stimulation that would give it more to process. Screens, which carry the input of the entire world at full volume, are not kind to a nervous system that is already working through a lot. Noise, conflict, caffeine, bright light in the final hours of the day. Each of these is more material arriving for the processing system to handle at the moment when what the system needs is for the incoming tide to slow. This is what researchers and practitioners describe as lowering the arousal floor before bed. The Yerkes-Dodson curve, that arc of arousal and performance, has an optimal range, and for a highly sensitive nervous system, that optimal range is reached at lower levels of external stimulation than for others. So the task of an evening is to move deliberately and gently down the curve, lowering the arousal level through quieter input, softer light, calmer sensation, until the level is low enough that the mind can make the transition into sleep without having to fight through a wall of remaining stimulation to get there. Journaling, or some form of deliberate processing, writing down the unfinished things, giving them a container outside the mind, can help too, because it allows the processing to complete outside the body, on the page, rather than having to complete inside the body in the dark. A deeply processing mind given a place to put things down can sometimes release them, at least for tonight, because they have been set somewhere real. They have not been abandoned. They are simply not needing to be held quite so tightly anymore. And then there is this, the quietest and perhaps most essential piece of the whole picture. Understanding the trait is itself a form of protection. Michael Pluess, working within the framework of Vantage Sensitivity and differential susceptibility, has pointed towards something that is simple and profound at once. For a highly sensitive person, a positive environment, an environment of accurate self-understanding, of self-acceptance, of being met without judgment and seen clearly, is exactly the kind of environment in which the trait flourishes. The sensitive benefit more from supportive conditions. And one of the most supportive conditions available is knowing what you are without shame, without the need to apologize for it, without the long-running project of trying to be less. Self-acceptance for a highly sensitive person is not a soft add-on. It is not a nice thought to have before bed. It is, in the language of the research, a positive environment. It is the kind of input that the trait responds to in the direction of thriving. Knowing that you process deeply and that deep processing is not a deficiency. Knowing that you saturate faster and that faster saturation is the cost of a processing system that also finds more in what it takes in. Knowing that you are not too much, not too emotional, not too easily affected, but tuned precisely and usefully to a wider range of input than most people around you are working from. That knowledge is itself something the nervous system can receive and rest inside, not as an instruction or a technique, but as a simple, steady fact. This is what I am. This is how I work. There is nothing to fix here. And so here, at the close of tonight, we can let ourselves gather the threads that have come through this long and slow unfolding. We began with an orchid and a dandelion, two plants in the same window, one thriving where the other merely survives. The orchid is not weaker. It is not inferior. It is built for a different kind of tending, and under the right conditions, it blooms in a way that makes the window extraordinary. That image, from researchers W. Thomas Boyce and Bruce Ellis, holds something essentially true about sensory processing sensitivity, the very trait that makes poor conditions harder, makes good conditions richer, more vivid, more fully inhabited. This is what Michael Pluess and Belsky named when they described the sensitive as the ones who respond more strongly to everything, for better and for worse, inseparably, always. We visited the brain in the scanner. Bianca Acevedo and her colleagues in 2014 asked highly sensitive people to look at photographs of faces, the faces of strangers and the faces of people they loved. And the insula, the region the neuroscientists sometimes call the seat of consciousness, the place where the body's interior signals and the world's emotional information and one's own awareness of being alive all meet and integrate. That region lit up more brightly in the highly sensitive than in others. The mirror neuron system through which one person's emotion is reflected in another person's nervous system as though it were happening in their own body, also more active. These are not metaphors. These are regions of actual tissue doing actual work in a brain that feels more because it processes more, and that processes more because it was built to. We followed the trail backward through time to Jerome Kagan's infants, who arrived into the world with their nervous systems already calibrated toward depth of response, showing from the earliest months the high reactivity to novelty that would shadow them gently into childhood and beyond. The trait is old. It is there from the beginning. Carl Jung wrote of an innate sensitiveness, recognizing something in his clinical work that the neuroimaging decades later would make visible in ways he could not have imagined. The sensitive have always existed. The name has changed. The phenomenon has not. We followed the trail outward through species, across more than 100 of them, from fruit flies and fish and birds to the primates who share our evolutionary history, and found that a responsive, observant, deeply processing minority strategy appears again and again across the living world, conserved by evolution, not because it is a mistake, but because it confers something useful. The one who pauses before acting, the one who notices the subtle shift, the one whose sensitivity to what is barely there serves the group in ways that speed and boldness cannot. Sensitivity, in this light, is not a deviation from the species. It is a strategy the species has kept deliberately across a very long span of time. We moved through the 4 pillars that Elaine N identified as the backbone of the trait: the depth of processing, the tendency toward overstimulation, the richness of emotional reactivity and empathy, the noticing of what is subtle and fine-grained and easy to miss. And we found the mechanism behind the most difficult part: why the loud day leaves you flooded, why the crowded room requires so much more recovery than it seems to require for others, why the return home feels like peeling something off, like finally being able to exhale. Deep processing is expensive, it is thorough, and it is careful, and it is rich, and it costs more than shallow processing costs, and it reaches saturation sooner. This is not weakness, it is the necessary other side of depth. We corrected some stories that have gathered around this trait and don't serve the people who carry it. That sensitivity is the same as introversion. It is not. And 3 in 10 highly sensitive people are extroverts who love the world of other people, even as that world tires them faster. That sensitivity is shyness. It is not, because shyness is a learned fear, and sensitivity is an innate way of working. That it belongs to women more than men, it does not. The distribution is roughly equal. What varies is how much room the culture gave it in different people's lives. That it is a disorder, a diagnosis, something clinical and broken and requiring repair. It is none of these things. It is a temperament trait present in a substantial portion of every human population ever studied, visible in infancy, traceable in the brain, documented across species. It is how some people are made. And we came to what might be the most important thing of all, the piece that is hardest to take in all at once and worth staying with a little longer, even now, even as sleep draws closer. The same wiring does everything. The same depth of processing that floods you on the hard days is what makes the beautiful days genuinely beautiful, in a way that goes deeper and stays longer than most people's beauty does. The same insula that aches in empathy, that takes on something of another person's sorrow or joy as though it were happening to you, is the insula that lights up at music, at the particular way a story lands, at the astonishing fact of a late afternoon that somehow, for no reason you could explain, breaks your heart with how much it is. The reactivity is not selective. It does not filter the good from the difficult and amplify only one. It amplifies the signal, whatever the signal is, and among the signals in any human life are things of incandescent beauty that a finely tuned instrument receives more completely than a less sensitive one does. You are not too much. That is the sentence this whole long night has been building toward. You are not too much, and the world was not right to suggest otherwise, and the processing that made you too much for certain rooms and certain speeds and certain kinds of days is the same processing that has allowed you to live certain moments more completely than most people around you have been able to. You are tuned in. You have always been tuned in. The question was never whether the tuning was correct. It was always about finding the conditions in which a tuned instrument can play what it is capable of playing. And those conditions include this: enough quiet, enough transition, enough low-input time at the end of the day for the processing to complete what it began, enough protection of the hours before sleep so that the arousal floor can lower itself gradually and the nervous system can follow it down without having to fight through new stimulation to get there, Enough nature, or enough of whatever soft fascination means for you, rain or quiet, or the particular dim comfort of a room that is asking nothing of you. Enough rest, taken without guilt, because rest is not laziness for a nervous system like yours. Rest is maintenance. It is how the instrument stays in tune. And enough self-acceptance to hold all of this without turning it into one more project of self-improvement. Understanding your nervous system is not a task. It is a gift you have been giving yourself tonight, slowly, in the dark, without urgency. You do not need to remember all of it. You do not need to take notes or make plans or arrive at conclusions before you are allowed to sleep. If one thing settled somewhere in you tonight, one small piece of recognition, one moment of feeling seen by the science and the story both, that is enough. That is more than enough. The rest will still be true in the morning. The orchid will still be in the window. The insula will still be lit. The 100 species will still carry their responsive minority, crossing the centuries with their particular attentiveness intact. And you will still be the person who notices things, who feels things at a depth that sometimes surprises even you, who arrives at the end of a full day carrying more than most people carried from the same day, and who sometimes needs to lie in the dark a little longer than others do before the body finally releases its hold on the day and lets sleep come. Let it come now. There is nothing left to process tonight that cannot wait for morning. The day has been received, and the processing has been running, and the mind has been doing what minds like yours do, working through, carefully, attentively, with the depth and thoroughness that is simply how it works. But the input has quieted now. The world has gone small and soft around you. What is left is the sound of your own breathing and the weight of a body that has been carrying you faithfully through everything, and the slow, organic lowering of all of it, the arousal, the attention, the careful noting of things, toward the still point where rest becomes possible. You do not have to do anything to help it. The tide goes out on its own when the world is quiet enough to let it. This room is quiet enough. You are moored safe in the sleepy harbor now. Drift off.